Hello and welcome, I'm Oles Gerjuk and you're watching Head to Head with UATV. In the process of building the rule of law, one of its most important criteria is to create a transparent judiciary. After the revolution of dignity, the Ukrainian power holders announced big reforms aiming to bring back trust in the judicial branch of the government. This process is closely supported by the international community. It plays a key role in pushing the reform towards implementation of the European standards. So how successful has judicial reform been so far, and what can Ukraine learn from the Western experience in this sphere? To talk more about this, we welcome to the studio today Bohdan Futey, Senior Judge of the United States Court of Federal Claims. Hello, and thank you for joining us today.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
It's a
Appreciate
pleasure.
it.
So, Mr. Futey, what's your opinion? What is the rule of law in a global scale?
All right. Well, let me just mention what I consider to be essential for the principles of rule of law. The rule of law is the linchpin to promote democracy through the world. And democracy, in turn, will provide a better and more prosperous economic life. But what do I mean by this? Number one would be the supremacy of the law, which means that all persons, individuals, and government officials are subject to the law. No one is above the law.
They obey.
And we're talking about a rule of law and not the law of the rule, like, for example, was during the Nazi Germany or the Soviet Union under the Communist Party. And the source of the law must be the people themselves. There has to be a concept of justice. And that concept of justice is probably the best way illustrated at the court where I am a senior judge, the U.S. Court of Federal Claims, where President Lincoln in 1855 said that it is as much the duty of the government to do justice against itself in favor of citizens as it is to administer the justice among private individuals. The court where I sit, the citizens of the United States have the right to sue the government for monetary damages.
Oh,
okay?
wow. This is a pretty difficult job.
It is. It is. I have been on the bench for 31 years,
Wow.
appointed by President Reagan, really, and confirmed by the Senate at that time. And also, under the rule of law, we're talking about the importance of the preservation of individual liberty. That's very important. Free speech, peaceful assembly, freedom of the press, worship, and equal opportunity. We're also talking about legislation should be prospective and not retrospective. We're talking about a political system based on the separation of powers. That is, you have an executive, legislative, and judicial power that interact and that have checks and balances. That's very important. And finally, there has to be an independent judiciary. You know, it may vary a little bit between countries that have the civil law and the common law, but the purpose, the aim is the same. And when we are talking about the judicial independence, what exactly do we mean? How do you strengthen the judicial independence?
How to strengthen it, yeah.
How do you strengthen that? You provide adequate salaries for judges. And that is basically to get rid of corruption, any possible corruption. You ensure appropriate funding for the courts. You have to have prompt publication and availability of judicial decisions. Today, I render a decision at the U.S. Court of Federal Claims. Tomorrow, that decision is already on the internet, and citizens of the country have the right to read it. They read it, they know what I'm doing, and that's why the judges, the federal judiciary in the United States last year received an approval of 68% by Gallup poll. The citizens said that they approve of the work what the federal courts are doing. There has to be a transparency in decisions. Judges should be isolated from politics. Public life tenure or a long-term tenure is very good. Judges should not fear of retaliation for rendering their decisions. The court administration should be part of the judiciary. The judiciary needs to have its own constituency. What's very important, the American Bar Association really sets up the standards for law schools and is very, very supportive of the judges, but also very, very critical of what the judges do. So you need a strong bar association. Unfortunately, I don't see that in Ukraine, and that to me is something that I have been preaching and talking here in Ukraine, that the bar association has to take the lead in some of these matters. You also need that you have to have judicial decisions enforced. The judiciary interprets the law, interprets the action of the executive branch, but the enforcement has to be done by the executive branch. You need a code of conduct for judges also. And judicial independence does not mean that judges do what they want. They have to do what is in the Constitution and what it is in the laws. That is very important. There are two aspects of judges must be independent. First, they must be honest brokers. They have to be neutral in understanding what's happening and ruling on issues. That's number one. Number two, is that the judiciary enhance each individual judge, in my view, must act as a co-equal. The judiciary must be a co-equal with the branch, with the other branches of government. Unfortunately, in Ukraine, although the Constitution provides for separation of powers, that is the three branches, the judiciary is not at the same level as the Constitution provides, and that, in my view, should change.
So now, the judiciary is on the higher level here?
No, I think that it's not at the equal level.
No,
my recommendation would be that the judiciary should be at the equal level with the other branches of government. Okay, so that's the way I see it. Now, when the Ukraine's constitution was adopted, it set up the three branches of government, also concerned about individual rights and everything else. And at that time, in 1996, it received the approval of the Venice Commission and other international organizations. However, with each president once elected, they talk about amending the Constitution. Yes. All right? So on amending the Constitution.
What are your thoughts? Should we amend the Constitution?
Well, yeah, we have already amended the Constitution dealing with the judiciary, you know, and actually you have certain things in there because, by the way, in the Constitution, Article 8 in the Constitution says that Article 8 declares that the rule of law is recognized and effective. So what I talk about, it should be already something that would be implemented. Is it implemented? Is something that we must talk about.
Yes, that's right. Those standards that you are mentioning are very crucial and vital for every judiciary, and basically they describe this impeccable judiciary. How to implement them in Ukraine?
Well, first of all, we have to know what has happened, all right? And right now, under President Poroshenko, a constitutional amendments were initiated, and especially the judicial reform, all right? So that has taken place, and the Constitutional Commission has been working. I'm a consultant to that Constitutional Commission. I've been working with them, and what we have done, we basically made quite a few changes. I'll talk about it in a minute. And finally, there was, you know, it had to go to the Constitutional Court first to decide whether this was in line with the Constitution. Then it had to be approved by the majority, right, by the 2/3 vote, over 300 members of Parliament. And that did happen on June 2nd, on 2016, when the law was adopted, and also over 305 deputies, I believe, voted on the constitutional changes that were made dealing with the judiciary. And right now, the judiciary is composed of courts of general jurisdiction. On the top, you know, it has so far, it has specialized courts. It has the civil branch, civil jurisdiction, criminal jurisdiction. It has intellectual property, and it has administrative jurisdiction. Those are at the top, the panels or the collegiums within the Supreme Court. All right. So that is very important. Also, there will be now another court that has been, you know, approved, and that's the anti-corruption court. My view is that actually it's good to have an anti-corruption court, but all courts should be anti-corruption. The reform was made specifically for the purpose to eliminate corruptions among the judiciary. So that is very important. You know, and the present government, you know, has undertaken that. Now, let me say that the long-expected reform did take place, as I told you. And
you're not speaking about the judicial reform in Ukraine.
I'm right. I'm not talking about any other reform. I'm not talking about decentralization or individual rights. Yeah. I'm talking about judicial reform. And the aim being to secure judicial independence in accordance with the principles, as I have noted, on the rule of law and elimination of corruption within the judiciary. That is extremely important. And as you know, what had happened, individuals started to apply and to be judges of the Supreme Court first. Yes. They had over 1,400 individuals had applied, many judges, some lawyers, and at the beginning, there were, so far, we have 118 judges on the Supreme Court that have gone through the Qualifications Commission and the Higher Council of Justice. They have been approved, and with the participation, there was a public integrity council or civil society that made a number of objections and a number of recommendations, and some of them were heard. Probably about 30% they objected to. Some of them were overruled, but at least they participated. And there are 118 judges, and there's a new chief judge of the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court has started to work. Actually, as of 2017, there's a new chief judge. And the Supreme Court has been formed and started its work last December.
Well, but speaking of the Supreme Court, some experts do say that the main risk of the current stage of judicial sector reform in Ukraine is that the creation of a new Supreme Court, as well as other courts, may still be politically influenced. How to escape from this? How to change that?
Well, really, politics has been taken away because the president is not in charge of this. He only makes the announcement, the appointments, what the Higher Council of Justice has decided. You have a process. First, they apply. They're examined. They're investigated by the Higher Qualifications Commission. There is a Qualifications Commission, and at that time, as I told you, there was a participation of the Public Integrity Council. They objected to many things, so that went. And then finally was the Higher Council of Justice that made the appointment based on what the Higher Qualification Commission has stated. And they presented the names of the judges to the president for appointment. That's so only a formality. The president was not involved in this individual selection of these people.
He cannot influence the decision.
And that's what happened. So I support that idea that although in the United States, appointment of federal judges is a very political matter because the president nominates them, okay, based on politics, basically. They have to have the background. They have to have the years. For example, I had to present, when I was nominated by President Reagan, I had to present like of 10 years, I had to present about 15 trials that I had in the past, names of attorneys, names of judges, and names of parties. And then the FBI did the investigation on all of that. They would admit whether I was qualified, number one, and also my moral character to be the judge. So that is in the United States. Now, as I said, the Supreme Court started to work, and it's working. Now the process is continuing because they're working. According to the constitutional changes, you need the Supreme Court may consist of 200 judges. Okay, so they're working on the rest of the judges, and they're also, the Qualifications Commission, the Higher Qualification Commission, is working on the other members of the judiciary. Don't forget, there are probably over 4,000 judges that have to go through the qualification process if they want to stay with the court and receive the salary now that the judges are getting. If not, then there could be a disciplinary problem. There's no question about it. So that's what I say. Now, there also has been, as far as the Constitutional Court, there has been a very important change. Or actually, number one is that the swearing in of the judges of the Constitutional Court will be done at the Constitutional Court, because previously what was happening, it was they had to be sworn in or take the oath of office at the Rada. Well, if the Rada did not like him, they would not schedule a swearing in, and therefore you had a crisis on the Constitutional Court because you did not have a quorum for a number of years. I wrote about it in the past. So now you don't have that. That's number one. And number two, individuals, now citizens of Ukraine, may file a request to challenge the constitutional laws. They may file that, but they have to first absorb all the remedies before getting there, all right? So they have to go through the process. But now they have the right. They did not have that right before.
Well, this is very interesting. Unfortunately, we are running out of time, although your comments are very valuable to us, and it's really interesting to get to know about all this changes.
I'm an optimist. I've been working with the judges here since the first Constitutional Court and the first Supreme Court. I've been member of the working group on the Ukraine's constitution. So I know we want everything to be done immediately.
Yes.
Progress has been made. It's a slow process.
But how would you evaluate the pace? Pardon? How would you evaluate? How would you assess the pace?
Well, I think it's, as I say, it's positive, but you have to give it time. We expect, for example, everything to be done immediately. It's not done immediately. It takes time. Let me give another observation. In Ukraine, everybody expects, for example, a judge renders an opinion at the trial level. And then the media writes saying, what kind of decision did he render or she render? This is wrong. Well, you never know, because there is a process. You have to go to the Court of Appeals to find out whether that was done properly or not. And then even from the Court of Appeals, you can go to the Supreme Court, especially now. When I render a decision in the United States, it goes to the Court of Appeals. The Court of Appeals can affirm me or they can reverse me. But then that decision could be appealed to the Supreme Court, and the decision is not final until the Supreme Court decides. So you have to give that time frame for the Supreme Court to decide or the Court of Appeals to decide before you can criticize the judge for rendering that decision.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much for being a guest today in our studio.
All right. Thank you for having me, and I hope everything will work out for Ukraine.
Yes, we hope so too. Thank you. That was Bohdan Futey, Senior Judge of the United States Court of Federal Claims. Thank you for watching Head to Head. I'm Alice Garduk. Goodbye.